Hi all, welcome to a new video and web application penetration testing tutorial. Today, we are going to have an overview of 3 of the most common cyber attacks: local file inclusion, remote file inclusion, and cross-site scripting. So, let's start. Here is today's agenda we are going to cover today. I will inform you more about file inclusions and their types. We will use DAM vulnerable web application to demonstrate how this vulnerability can be exploited. Then, we will demonstrate the second cyber attack for today, cross-site scripting, where the name comes from, and the evolution of cross-site scripting. After that, we will talk about cross-site scripting attack types, such as reflected or non-persistent XSS and stored or persistent XSS. Finally, we will move to our practical part of today's tutorial by discussing how to perform a cross-site scripting attack on the DAM vulnerable web application. Let's start. First, let's understand what a file inclusion attack is. Well, it is an attack that allows an attacker to include a file on the web server through a PHP script. A file inclusion vulnerability differs from a generic directory traversal attack in that the latter is used to gain unauthorized access to the file system, while the former involves manipulating the way an application loads code for execution. If a file inclusion vulnerability is successfully exploited, it can lead to remote code execution on the web server running the affected application. This can lead to one of the following attacks: code execution on the web server or executing malicious code on the server exploiting this vulnerability. Cross-site scripting attacks, which we are going to discuss later in this tutorial. Denial of service or DOS attacks, prevent the server from handling legitimate client requests. Data manipulation attacks and adding modifications to the data on the vulnerable server or vulnerable web application. Now, let's move the types of file inclusion attacks. There are 2 types of this attack: local file inclusion and remote file inclusion. LFI vulnerabilities refer to a situation where an attacker can access and potentially execute files on the victim's machine. This can be particularly risky if the web server is running with elevated privileges due to a misconfiguration, as the attacker could potentially obtain sensitive information. Additionally, if the attacker can insert code onto the web server through alternative means, they may be able to run arbitrary commands. However, remote file inclusion or RFI vulnerabilities are more readily exploitable but occur less frequently. Instead of gaining access to a file stored locally, the attacker can execute code that is hosted on their machine. Remote file inclusion, RFI, and local file inclusion, LFI, are commonly identified vulnerabilities in poorly coded web applications. These vulnerabilities arise when a web application permits users to input data into files or upload files to the server. It's time for the practical part of this tutorial. Let's start demonstrating file inclusion attacks using DAM vulnerable web application. If you don't know how to get DAM vulnerable web application in your virtual lab, please take a quick look at our previous tutorials and how to set up your home virtual lab environment. Now start your virtual machine and log into DVWA, as shown in the figure below, then go to the DVWA Security tab and change the difficulty level to low. After that, go to the File Inclusion tab and change the URL from include.php to the command as shown in the figure below. Now, let's change include.php to http://www.google.com for example, so the final URL will look like what is shown in the below figure. Let's move to the second attack we will discuss today, the cross-site scripting attack, or XSS attack. Cross-site scripting, XSS, is a type of attack where a hacker injects client-side scripts into web pages that are viewed by others. This can happen when user input that is not trusted is displayed on a web page without being sanitized or encoded correctly. Unfortunately, XSS is a common problem and is considered one of the top 10 vulnerabilities according to the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, which can pose a serious threat. However, the good news is that it can be easily prevented by properly sanitizing user inputs. But where the name comes from, well, back in the early days of JavaScript, hackers figured out they could load a legitimate website as a frame in another website and then use JavaScript to read into it. That is, one website could use scripting to cross a boundary into another website, and XSS was born. But it's important to know that cross-site scripting has adopted the acronym XSS to distinguish it from cascading style sheets, CSS, the language used to describe the visual presentation of web pages. The term cross-site implies a malicious website intruding into the functionality of a legitimate website, but this was evolved, whereas today it mainly describes injecting malicious code onto a legitimate, but vulnerable, website, that is to say the second, malicious site typically is not present. If the XSS is effective, the hacker can easily do one of the following attacks: steal the client's cookies, perform a session hijacking, or even redirect the client to malicious websites, and it can also allow the attacker to access hardware by turning on a webcam, mic, or GPS. Cross-site scripting has two types. Let's discuss them now briefly. Let's start with the first type, the reflected or what is called non-persistent cross-site scripting. In the context of XSS discussions, we usually consider three entities: a user, a legitimate website that the user intends to visit, and a hacker who aims to send a harmful payload to the user. Reflected XSS refers to a situation where a hacker successfully inserts code into the user's request, and the legitimate website returns it to the user without sanitizing it. Typically, the XSS payload is concealed within a seemingly genuine URL that directs to a legitimate website that is, however, vulnerable to such attacks. To summarize the attack: the attacker convinces a user to click a maliciously crafted link to a legitimate, but vulnerable, website. The attack payload is sent to the server inside the client's request. Server-side processing incorporates the malicious script into the web page and returns it to the client. The client browser executes the malicious script. The second type is stored or persistent cross-site scripting. Persistent XSS refers to the case where a hacker can inject code that is stored on a web server, and thus the malicious code originates from the server, as opposed to the client. If the site does not properly sanitize inputs, when the user visits the site, the hacker's code is sent to the user. A typical example would be a post on a social media website. The hacker makes a post that is JavaScript. When the user visits the site, the JavaScript is loaded and run in their browser. To summarize the attack: attacker injects attack payload into the website's database, example by posting a maliciously crafted comment to a blog. The user visits the legitimate website and requests the affected page. The website generates the page, example loads the most recent comments from the database, and returns the result to the client. The client browser executes the malicious script. The final type of cross-site scripting attack we are going to discuss today is the DOM-based cross-site scripting attack. DOM-based XSS is similar to reflected XSS in the sense that the attack begins by trying to get the user to visit a maliciously constructed URL, to a legitimate site. The legitimate site reflects the code to the user, but the attack occurs indirectly in the DOM, instead of directly in the returned HTML. To summarize the attack: the attacker convinces a user to click a maliciously crafted link to a legitimate website, as in the reflected attack. The server returns HTML including the vulnerable JavaScript to the client. The client browser executes the vulnerable JavaScript returned by the website, which loads the payload into the DOM at runtime. Notice, unlike the reflected attack, the attack payload is not directly included in the HTML returned by the server. In reflected and stored XSS you would expect to see script malicious code /script directly in the returned HTML. But in DOM-based XSS, the payload is only observed at runtime. Let's practice what we have learned today using DAM vulnerable web application. First of all, we will set the security level in Diva as shown in the corresponding figure. There are 3 security levels: high, medium, and low. Click on DVWA Security in the left-hand menu. Then, select Low. Click Submit. Now, let's try a basic XSS attack. As shown below, once DVWA is up and running, we'll start by going to the DVWA Security tab and setting the security level to low. Next, we go to the reflected XSS tab. Start by entering some text into the "What is your name?" text box and hit Submit. The result will be, "Hello" and whatever you type. So instead of entering plain text, try entering the shown JavaScript code. Of course, if you can inject JavaScript, you can probably HTML. One popular XSS tactic of yesteryear was to load another web page in an iframe. Now in reflected XSS, we're usually talking about the malicious code being delivered in a URL. Suppose we wish to encode our first example as a URL. Now imagine we put this link in an email. Even if the user inspects the link and finds the site is legitimate, if the site is vulnerable to XSS, then the user will still be subjected to the attack unless, of course, the user has JavaScript disabled. To demonstrate stored XSS, select XSS stored from the left navigation menu as shown in the corresponding figure. Follow the steps as shown in the figure, then, click Sign Guest Book. As shown in the figure, notice that the JavaScript alert we just created is now displayed. Every time a user comes to this forum, this XSS exploit will be displayed. This exploit can be easily modified to capture cookie or session information for future man-in-middle attacks. Now, click OK. And now, we have discussed all our topics for today. I wish you have got a good understanding of today's tutorial. Looking forward to hearing from you if you have any comments.